So, here's the deal. I'm a 25-year-old guy named Jake. I'd been living with my two roommates, Emma and Chris, for about a year. We were all in this downtown apartment that wasn't too bad on the outside, but had this weird energy. It was the kind of place you'd live in if you were just trying to survive, not thrive. But it worked for us. At least, that's what I thought until one night when everything flipped upside down. It was the middle of the month when it happened, so, not even rent day. You know how it goes, the cycle of paying bills and figuring out who's responsible for what gets old after a while, but this time was different. I had sent the rent money over, like I always did, and it was done. I took care of it. I always did. I'm the type who doesn't leave things to chance. Money's tight, and there's always the risk that someone forgets to send their part, but not this time. Everything was smooth. Or so I thought. The first thing I noticed when I came home that evening was that the door to the apartment was locked. Well, locked. You know what I mean? I've lived in places where the lock's kind of finicky, and you have to jiggle the handle a few times, but this was different. I had to pull out my key and force it. Weird, but I brushed it off at first. But as soon as I stepped in, something hit me. It was quiet. Too quiet. Emma and Chris were usually all over the place, loud, messy, music blasting, their typical chaos. But today? Nothing. The silence felt heavy, like the kind of silence you get right before a storm. Hello? I called out, feeling a little dumb. I mean, I live here, right? I have every right to be home. No answer. I shook it off, figuring maybe they were out or just chilling in their rooms. But then I started noticing the small things. The empty cups and dishes piling up on the coffee table, things that would normally be scattered around the kitchen or living room, but everything was eerily neat. Too neat. Almost as if someone had planned it that way. And then it hit me, there was no sign of my stuff. My keys, my shoes, it was all gone. Well, almost all of it. My jacket was hanging by the door, but that was it. At this point, I wasn't sure if I was walking into some kind of prank or if I'd accidentally walked into the wrong apartment. But when I saw that lock on the door to the bedroom I shared with Chris, I felt my stomach tighten. That wasn't normal. I knocked, half expecting him to yell at me through the door, but nothing. I swear, something clicked in my head at that moment. I didn't understand it fully yet, but I knew something wasn't right. I stood there for a second, just staring at the lock. Then I tried my key. It didn't fit. Not a chance. It was like the door had just changed. Like someone had taken the time to swap out the locks, all while I was gone. This wasn't just a mistake. No. This was deliberate. I started to pace, trying to calm myself, but the more I thought about it, the more I felt my anxiety surge. Who changes locks without telling anyone? Especially when I've already paid for the month? I wasn't just some random roommate to them. We had an agreement. Rent was paid. It was done. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest now. What the hell was going on? Why were they treating me like this? I banged on Chris's door again. Nothing. I turned to Emma's room next. Maybe she would know what was happening, what this weirdness was about. I knocked, louder this time. No answer. That's when the reality of it hit me. I was locked out. Not just of the apartment, but out of this twisted situation they clearly set up. I don't know why, but I could almost hear the cold, calculated way they'd planned this. I stepped back, trying to think. My hands were shaking now. There was only one thing left to do. I picked up my phone, dialed the number that I'd been holding back for months now, the landlord's number. I pressed it to my ear, listening to the dial tone, not sure if I was about to regret this or not. But honestly, at that moment, I didn't care. The rent was paid. I had every right to be in that apartment, and they were going to pay for pulling this stunt. The moment I heard the landlord's voice on the other end, a sense of calm washed over me. But I knew something was coming, something huge, and I was ready. I wasn't going to let them get away with it. "Hey, this is Jake. I need to talk to you about something." The landlord picked up on the second ring. "Hey, Jake. What's up?" I took a breath, trying to steady myself. "So, listen. Something's weird at the apartment. Emma and Chris, well, they changed the locks on me. I paid rent for this month, you know, just like I always do. But now I can't get in. No one's answering, and I don't have access to my own place anymore." There was a moment of silence, just a few seconds, but it felt like eternity. I could hear him shuffling papers on the other end. Maybe he was pulling up the lease agreement, I don't know. But then he said, "Jake, hold on a sec. Let me check something." I stood there, staring at the door, my nerves crawling up my spine. Was this it? Was I about to get screwed over? It didn't feel right. It didn't feel right. It felt like I was on the edge of something bigger, like this wasn't just a petty roommate squabble. I had this gnawing feeling in my gut, the kind that tells you something's wrong but doesn't tell you exactly what it is. Finally, he came back on the line, but his voice sounded a bit off. "Jake, I'm looking at the records here. It says Emma and Chris called me earlier. They, asked me to change the locks." My chest tightened, and I felt a spike of anger bubbling up. They did this behind my back? Without telling me? After I'd already paid the rent? That wasn't just disrespectful. That was crossing a line. "What do you mean they asked you to change the locks?" I nearly snapped. I wasn't even trying to hide my frustration anymore. "You can't just let them do that. I'm living here too. I paid my part. You don't get to just change the locks without telling me." The landlord let out a sigh. "I understand, Jake, I do. But they said it was an urgent situation. Something about personal safety concerns? They told me you weren't paying your share of the rent, and they felt like they needed to make a move before things got worse. I'm sorry, but I can't override their decision." I felt my blood boil. Personal safety concerns? I had no idea what they were talking about. This wasn't about safety. This was about something else. This was about power. Control. "Wait, so you're telling me they can just lock me out, and you're okay with it?" I felt the disbelief in my own voice, like it couldn't possibly be true, but somehow, it was. "I know it seems weird, but they..." "No," I cut him off. "This is insane. I have rights here. I paid for this month's rent. I've been here the longest out of all of us. You can't just side with them like this." There was a long pause before the landlord replied, much quieter now. "Jake, I hear you. But I'm just the property manager. I can't get involved in personal disputes between tenants. I think it's best if you all sort this out amongst yourselves." I hung up the phone, my hands shaking. So this was it, huh? This was how it was going to go down. They had the landlord on their side, and now I was stuck. Locked out of my own apartment. No one was answering the phone. No one was there when I knocked. I needed to think. I needed to plan. I pulled out my phone and stared at the screen for a while, running through every possible move. Every option felt like a dead end. What could I do? Who could I call? I needed a game plan. I couldn't just let them get away with this. And sure, I could wait for them to come back and have another confrontation, but I didn't want to just walk in and hope they'd listen. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was intentional. They wanted to make my life difficult. So, I did what anyone in my position would do. I called the only person I could think of who might actually help, my dad. He picked up after the first ring. "What's going on, Jake?" I felt a wave of frustration hit me as I quickly explained everything that had gone down. The lock, the phone call to the landlord, Emma, and Chris's bizarre behavior. "This is messed up, Dad. I don't know what to do." The landlord's siding with them. "They won't even pick up the phone. What do I do now?" My dad listened for a second before answering. "Listen, you've got to go to the source. The lease. Get your hands on it. If you're paying rent, you've got rights. You've got to find out where they're getting their information, and you've got to counteract it." I hung up, my mind racing. The lease. Of course. Why hadn't I thought of that before? If I could just get my hands on a copy, I'd have something concrete. Something to back me up. But there was one problem. Emma had the lease. She was the one who handled all the documents, always did. I had no idea where she kept them, but she always kept them hidden in the apartment, and now I couldn't even get inside. I stood there, outside the door, feeling more alone than I ever had. There was no way to get to Emma. No way to get to Chris. No way to get to that lease. And that's when it hit me. There was no more waiting. No more hoping things would just work out. I had to take action. And right now, I didn't care how messy it would get. I had to find a way in. I knew sitting around wasn't going to fix anything, but where the hell was I supposed to go from here? I was staring at that damn door like it was a ticking time bomb, but I had no idea what my next move should be. I glanced at my phone again, but nothing had changed. Emma and Chris still weren't picking up. I couldn't get through to the landlord again. I was on my own in this, and that reality hit harder than the cold metal of the locked door. My heart was pounding, but my mind was spinning too fast. I had to do something. Fast. I couldn't just sit there and let them screw me over. They wanted to play games, fine. I could play too. The first thing I did was head downstairs to the building's lobby, hoping maybe one of the neighbors had seen something. I needed information. Maybe someone had heard something. Maybe someone saw Emma or Chris leave earlier, and that would give me a clue about where they'd gone. But when I reached the first floor, I immediately realized something. The building was quieter than usual. Too quiet. No one was hanging around in the common areas. No one was on the elevator or the stairs. Everyone was either gone or staying out of sight, and that made me feel even more isolated. I stopped at the front desk. The building manager, a grumpy guy named Greg, was reading a magazine, completely oblivious to my presence. But I wasn't in the mood to be polite. I walked right up to him. "Hey, Greg," I said, trying to keep my voice calm but failing miserably. "You seen Emma or Chris around today?" He looked up, blinking at me like I was interrupting his entire life. No. Not today." "Why?" "They changed the locks to our apartment. I paid the rent this month, and now they're keeping me out." "You seen anything weird?" Greg just shrugged, tossing his magazine aside like he didn't care. "Can't help you, man. You've got issues with your roommates, not with the building. You know the rules. Don't get me involved in your drama." I felt a hot flash of anger run through me. Drama? Seriously? He was literally the building manager. It was his job to make sure this kind of stuff didn't happen. But I wasn't about to waste more time on him. I needed a new plan. I stepped outside for a minute, taking a deep breath, trying to cool down. The streets were buzzing, people rushing by, going about their business. Meanwhile, I was stuck in this twisted game, alone, with no way out. That's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. Emma. She was walking across the street, heading toward a coffee shop. She didn't even see me at first, too busy scrolling through her phone. But the sight of her, all calm and unbothered, made my rage flare up again. I didn't even think twice. I marched straight toward her, my heart racing. "Emma!" I shouted, before I could stop myself. She looked up, surprised, her eyes widening. "Jake? What the hell? What are you doing here?" I couldn't hold back anymore. "What's going on? Why'd you change the locks? I've paid my rent. You don't get to lock me out of my own apartment. What the hell is your problem?" She took a step back, clearly thrown off by my aggression. "Jake, calm down. It's not like that. Just give us some time. We've got our reasons." I could barely contain myself. "What reasons? You've been my roommate for a year. You could have talked to me like an adult instead of acting like I'm some kind of intruder in my own home. I don't even know what the hell's going on anymore." She bit her lip, clearly uncomfortable, glancing around like she was trying to avoid attention. "Look, it's not personal. You're not getting it. Things are changing around here. We're just trying to figure it all out." "Figure it out?" I laughed, the sound coming out rougher than I wanted. "Figure what out, exactly?" "You've changed the locks, and now I'm locked out of my own place with no explanation." She hesitated, looking conflicted. "I can't say much right now. It's complicated. We'll talk later, okay?" I shook my head, my frustration boiling over. "No. We're talking now. You're not getting away with this. You think you can just screw me over and act like everything's fine? I'm done. I'll call the cops if I have to." Her eyes widened, and I saw a flicker of panic cross her face. But before she could respond, I turned on my heel and started walking back to the building. I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. As I approached the apartment, I could see the shadows in the windows, and I knew they were in there. I didn't know what they were doing, but I knew they were up to something. My mind raced. Should I confront them? Should I just break down the door? No. I had to play this right. I had the landlord's number. They couldn't keep me out forever. I paced back and forth outside, my mind spinning, trying to keep my cool. But it felt like time was running out. They were getting away with it. And if I didn't do something soon, I'd lose everything. I stood in front of that apartment door, fists clenched, my heart pounding in my chest. I had tried everything, confronting Emma, getting the landlord involved, and now here I was, in this sick game of waiting and hoping that somehow, they'd just let me back in. But I knew better. This wasn't going to be over with a simple apology. Not by a long shot. I don't know how long I stood there, pacing back and forth outside that door, before I heard the sound of footsteps approaching. My get twisted. It was them. Emma and Chris, probably coming back from wherever they'd been hiding out, thinking they were in control. I didn't wait for them to make the first move. No, I wasn't going to let them get away with it. Not anymore. "Hey!" I shouted as they rounded the corner. They froze, their eyes wide with surprise. "What the hell is going on, Jake?" Chris asked, his voice sharp, like he was still trying to keep this cool. But I could see the panic creeping into his eyes. "I'm done with this, Chris. You think you can just lock me out of my own apartment and have everything go back to normal?" "That's not how this works," I said, my voice low but steady. Emma opened her mouth to speak, but I cut her off. "I've already called the landlord. And trust me, I'm not backing down." Their faces drained of color. For a second, I could see the guilt creeping into their expressions. They hadn't expected me to do this. They hadn't thought I'd actually call their bluff. but now they had to face the consequences of their little power play. You called him?" Emma's voice was barely a whisper, but the shock in her tone said everything. "Yeah, I did. And guess what? I've got the lease right here," I said, holding up a copy I'd somehow managed to get my hands on earlier after searching through the mess in the living room. "You two can't just do whatever you want. I live here too. This isn't just your apartment." Chris tried to laugh it off, but it came out strained. "You really think the landlord cares about some petty little fight between roommates? He's not gonna get involved in that." "I don't need him to get involved," I said, walking up to the door and holding the lease out for them to see. "I've got proof. The rent's paid. It's my name on the damn lease, not yours. And I'm not going anywhere." Emma's eyes flicked nervously to Chris, and for a brief moment, I saw something I hadn't expected, a crack in their armor. She knew they were wrong, and I could see the tension mounting between them. Whatever this was about, they weren't as sure of it as they'd pretended to be. "You don't get it, Jake," Chris muttered, his face red with frustration. "It's more complicated than you think. We didn't want to do this, but nothing," I interrupted. "If you had a problem, you should have come to me like an adult. Not pull some cheap stunt like this." For a second, no one spoke. The air between us was thick with tension, like a storm just about to break. They knew they were cornered. I could see it in their eyes. "I don't care what you think is going on, but you're not doing this anymore," I said, my voice firm. "Either you unlock the door and let me back in, or we're going straight to the landlord's office and handling this the right way. I've had enough of this nonsense." The silence stretched on, like the calm before the final clash. I could see Emma's shoulders sag, the fight leaving her. Chris, on the other hand, was still trying to hold on to whatever control he thought he had, but it was clear he was losing the battle. Finally, it was Emma who spoke, her voice quieter than before. "Fine. You win, Jake." She pulled the keys out of her pocket and walked over to the door. My heart skipped a beat as I watched her slide the key into the lock. There was a click, and the door swung open, but not before I heard Chris let out a frustrated sigh, like he was defeated, but still unwilling to admit it. He glanced at me one last time, his eyes narrowed. "You better watch yourself, Jake," he muttered under his breath, like he was trying to warn me. But there was no real conviction behind his words anymore. He knew they'd lost this round. I stepped inside the apartment, taking in the familiar surroundings, the couch, the kitchen table, the clutter that was always there when Emma and Chris were around. It felt right. This was my place, too. "I'm not going to forget this," I said, my voice low. "I don't care if we're roommates, but don't ever try to pull something like this again." Emma didn't say anything. She just stood there, her arms crossed, looking defeated. Chris, on the other hand, shot me one last dirty look before he walked out of the room without another word. And just like that, the tension broke. The weight of the whole situation lifted off my shoulders. They tried to take control, tried to push me out of my own life, but in the end, it was me who walked back through that door. It wasn't over, not yet. But for the first time in days, I felt like I'd taken back what was mine. The days that followed felt like a whirlwind. I wasn't exactly sure what was going to happen next, but I knew one thing: I wasn't going to let Emma and Chris walk all over me again. The power dynamic had shifted, but the storm wasn't over yet. There was a lot left to untangle, and I had no idea where it was going to lead. But I had to make it clear, once and for all, that I wasn't the person to mess with. When I first stepped through that door after Emma reluctantly unlocked it, I thought things would be fine. Maybe they'd back off, apologize, and we'd all move on, pretending like the weirdness had never happened. But that's not how it went down. Chris was still distant. There was this coldness between us now, something unspoken but undeniable. Emma, though, she seemed different. She was quieter, almost as if she knew I'd won. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. No, far from it. That night, I tried to keep my distance. I retreated to my room, feeling like I needed some space to process everything that had happened. But it was hard to ignore the tension in the apartment. I could hear their voices in the living room, talking in hushed tones, and every now and then, I'd hear a sharp, angry word slip through the cracks. They were talking about me, no doubt. But I didn't care. I wasn't interested in their side of the story anymore. At some point, Emma knocked on my door. When I opened it, she looked more exhausted than I'd ever seen her. There was no defiance left in her eyes, just a kind of resignation. "I know you're angry," she said, voice soft, almost apologetic. "But you've got to understand. We didn't want it to get to this point. We didn't know how else to handle it." I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Handle what, exactly?" She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "We've been struggling, Jake. We've been barely scraping by, and we were hoping you'd help out more. You don't always pull your weight around here. We were just trying to get your attention." I blinked, processing her words. "So that's why you locked me out? You thought that was going to fix things? You could have just talked to me." "I'm not some mind reader, Emma." She winced, like my words hit harder than I intended. "I know. I get it now. We messed up, okay? We should have been more direct with you." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to scream at her, tell her how messed up everything had been, how they betrayed me. But another part of me, maybe the part that just wanted peace, knew that we had bigger issues to fix. "Look, I'm not just gonna forget this," I finally said, my voice low. "But I'm willing to work through it. If you're really sorry and want to fix things, we need to figure out how to make it work. No more games." She nodded, her eyes softening. "Yeah. No more games. I promise." And with that, the tension in the air seemed to lift, at least for a moment. But there was still work to be done. The next couple of days were awkward. We had some long talks, some better than others, about rent, boundaries, and communication. Chris, surprisingly, was more willing to listen than I expected. At first, I thought he'd just brush everything off, but he didn't. He admitted that he had been feeling the pressure too, that he was worried about bills, and that he thought locking me out would somehow force me to pay more attention to our situation. It wasn't ideal, but I appreciated that he was being honest about it. Still, I couldn't just let it slide. Trust was broken, and it was going to take time to rebuild. We eventually came to an agreement. I would take over some of the responsibilities they'd been struggling with, and we would all be more transparent moving forward. I would pay my share of the bills on time, and we would communicate better about expenses. No more sneaky moves, no more surprises. But even with the agreement in place, I knew things weren't going to go back to normal. Maybe they never would. There was still a lingering sense of unease every time I walked through the front door. I'd caught them in a little game, but it wasn't over yet. They changed the rules, and I'd had to stand my ground to make sure I didn't get steamrolled. And here's the thing, I realized something important in all of this. People will test you. They'll push boundaries, try to take control, and see how far they can go before you snap. But once you stand up for yourself, once you draw that line in the sand, you're never the same. I wasn't the guy who let things slide anymore. I wasn't the guy who kept his head down and hoped for the best. No, I was the guy who had enough, who wasn't afraid to call out bullshit, and who made sure people knew that messing with him had consequences. Maybe Emma and Chris would respect me more now. Or maybe not. But either way, they knew I wasn't someone they could walk over. And that, well, that felt pretty damn good.